Then welcome to the second day. I am glad to introduce our first speaker for today, Preston Stovall from the University of Hradec Králové. And Preston is about to publish a book on a very interesting and broad ranging project. And he will also talk about that project in his paper, which is called Shared Intentionality and Discursive Cognition. So please, Preston, go ahead.
We can't hear you, Preston. We can't hear you.
Yes. Okay. How's that?
Yeah.
Good.
We can hear you
okay. Now. Good. Thank you all for showing up, and I'm thrilled to be here. This is such a great meeting of people, so I'm really excited. What I'm going to do, so let me share screens here. I've got a presentation. I uploaded an essay just a couple of days ago. I don't expect people would have had time to read it, and it's not necessary. So let me at least get a PowerPoint up here, and I'll work through that. Okay, is that on? Everyone can see that, I hope.
Yes.
Okay, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to talk about the relationship between shared intentionality and discursive cognition. And as Stephanie mentioned, this comes out of material that I have been working on in Hradec Králové for the last couple of years, and that will appear in a book hopefully in September. I sent the proofs off, final version of the proofs off a couple of days ago, about a week ago. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to start by just laying out the problem space that I'm addressing these issues. I'm then going to look at non-discursive, intentional, and deontic cognition. This came up a little bit in Wilfrid's talk. I think it's important that we be able to tell a story about the ontogeny and the phylogeny of discursive cognition. And my view is going to be that in both cases, intentionality is an important part of that story. So I'll start by looking at non-discursive, intentional, and deontic cognition. I'll do that fairly quickly. There's quite a bit here, and so I'm going to be going through some of it quicker than other bits, meaning that I've got an audience familiar with some of this stuff more than others. I'm then going to look at discursive, intentional, and deontic cognition, and I'm going to do that by way of a semantics for the modal operators for shared intentionality and for deontic modality. Talk of what's obliged, permitted, and forbidden in terms of agency. I'm then going to look at some formal properties of the semantics. And in the breakout session yesterday, Wilfrid said that when he was a graduate student, he took it as important to at least get enough logic on board. I hope I'm getting Bill's claim here right, that it was important to at least get enough logic on board to be able to tell when presented with a wall of symbolic text, whether there was anything interesting there or whether you were just being beat with text. So my hope is in discussing the formal stuff in sections 3 and 4, that I can at least address the kind of concerns that somebody like Bill would have. So I'm not going to go into the details of that very much, but there's enough there, I hope, for those of you that are interested in that kind of material to see what's going on, and I'm definitely willing to talk about it in the Q&A. I'm then going to look at empirical support and predictions that this account makes, because if I'm right, we can glean substantive metaphysical commitments about the nature of discursive cognition or rationality in terms of a semantics for these modal operators. So I'm going to argue that there's some empirical support for the position developed, and that it makes some predictions that are worth taking seriously. Okay, so that's the first half of the talk. This is stuff that I think of as mostly complete. I'm happy with the material up to here. Beginning in part 6, though, I'm going to look at some issues that I'm less confident about, and that's sort of work in progress. So first, I'm going to look at the relationship between intentional and deontic cognition in practical reasoning. I'm then going to draw a contrast between proof theory and model theory, because everything I'm going to be doing up to this point is in terms of model theory, and I think it's important to think about proof theory. Sorry, someone's got their mic on. Are you saying something to me, or is this just a mic?
And maybe, Preston, it's just that we sometimes can't hear you, right? Maybe you could go closer to your microphone.
Oh, sure, absolutely. And I'm at my parents' place in the mountains of Montana, and they have some weird kind of janky internet connection here. So that may be an issue too. So if there are problems, raise a hand or no, and I'll try to address that. Okay, so I'll look at proof theory and model theory. I'm then going to look at Stephanie's metalinguistic interpretation of Sellars' account of shared intentionality. She's published this essay recently. I think it's a great reading. A number of us have discussed it, so I'm going to discuss that quickly and try to slot it in to the view I'm developing, particularly with regards to the relationship between proof theory and model theory. I'm then going to look at a proof theory account of the it's been advanced Luca Incurvati and Julian Schroeder, and argue that their notion of rejection can be seen as a kind of rejection or something similar to what I'm doing. And again, this is at this point, I'm really sort of in the weeds when it comes to not sure what to think about this stuff. And then if there's time at the end, I want to address Hegel's notion of absolute knowing as a way of spelling out truth conditions for sharing mental states and thinking about what it is to be one of us as a claim about the way things are. I doubt I'll get to that knowing, but at least on there, so we can address it. Okay, so there's a common view in philosophy across the board that views declarative claims as representations of the way the world is, or the way the space of possible worlds is. So this view foregrounds representational intentionality, where the mind is meant at the world. And normative assessment of claims then is measured in terms of whether the mind is representing the world correctly. Now, Neil Belknap declares this, or a version of this kind of principle, the declarative fallacy, the thought that just because something's in a declarative mood, it's meant to represent the world. But oftentimes we say things that are declaratives that don't clearly have that function. So something like the cups go in the cupboard might be a way of communicating to a roommate how to organize the house, or a friend help clean up. From an employer to an employee, it might be a command. So this came up yesterday in Heath's discussion. Stephanie mentioned that context is going to matter a lot for settling some of the claims that we make and trying to determine whether they have one order of intentionality or another. And I think that's correct. And we need to bear in mind that there are these two complementary ways we can think about the mind in relation to the world. And so approaching from the other direction, some of the claims we make that are declarative have the world to mind direction of fit, where normative assessment is measured not in terms of whether the mind is representing the world, but rather in terms of whether the world is as the mind plans it to be. And so I want to give a semantics then for modal operators that give expression to shared intentions and deontic judgments, where I understand it as having this practical intentionality. So overall, my hope is that I've provided a framework that can be used by philosophers, linguists, and scientists to look at the relationship between discursive and non-discursive cognition in human beings. So in the book in particular, I try to address a number of issues that come up in these fields in a way that's neutral between some of the substantive commitments between them, so as to give a common framework, but then also to show how work can address some of the issues, because I think it provides a resource for engaging with some of this stuff. So originally I thought I'd give a kind of historical approach to this talk because Allan Gibbard was going to be here and I'm using Gibbard's stuff. Since he's not able to make it, I think I'm going to focus more on the topical thing. So I'll flag some of the issues that come up in the history of philosophy about this issue. But for the most part, I'm just going to present it as it is as the idea. And I'm going to try to minimize the formalism and give a general. I see this research program. My hope is that other people will see it as well. And so maybe that this is a kind of advertisement. I'm hoping I can bring people around it to seeing things my view or my point of view, or at the very least, seeing that my point of view is worth arguing with to show me that I'm wrong about something. So I look forward to that. Okay, so in the book I give, it's called The Single-Minded Animal, that'll clear in a little bit. I give an account of discursive cognition, understood as obedience to rules of thought and action, in terms of a semantics for intentional and deontic modalities. The idea is that to obey a rule is to exercise deontic cognition. Deontic cognition is species of rationality, and use theory plans of action as the world of mind correlates to worlds as a basis for interpreting mind to fit world representational sense. So use worlds and plans to account for the two directions of intentionality. And then draw inferences. And then the idea, once this model is up and running, to draw inferences about the nature of discursive cognition or shared intentionality in terms of the kinds of things that have to be imposed on the model to get the semantics right, to get the right kind of entailments, and to see that you get the sort of logic you want out of the semantics like this. So the key thesis I'm defending is that shared intentionality is the basis for and a foundation for the self-government that comes with deontic cognition. That's the key idea. Okay, to do this fairly quickly, I think that the notion of picturing is an important part of any kind of philosophical anthropology. I do picturing as a reliable variation, a world-world relation between ultimately states of the central nervous system and properties in the environment, processes ultimately in the environment. So, and I think of it as having a primitive mind-to-world and world-to-mind intentionality. So when I reach to pick a glass up where I see where the glass is, I'm not only representing the space around me, but I'm engaged in it in certain ways that prepare me to act in ways that allow me to manipulate it. So I think picturing is at its basis a kind of non-discursive cognition. This is the sort of thing that bees can do, ants, animals across the board. But in addition to picturing, I think we need a notion of shared practical picturing and what I call deontic picturing. So this will come up a little bit later, but basically the idea is that shared practical picturing involves motor representational neural mirroring. So this is monkeys in the 90s, and we've since found that it's across the animal kingdom. When I do something like move a cup up to a countertop and you watch me, there's a part of your motor representational complex that is planning from your perspective to do what I'm doing as if you were me. So it's not just that you're representing what I'm doing from your point of view, you're actually engaged in your practical faculties in ways that would be appropriate if you were the one who was doing it. So I think this is a kind of shared practical picturing, and you can see how this would facilitate shared agency. If you and I are moving a table up a flight of stairs that's narrow and turns, I see that you need to get the legs up on the side. I know that I need to go down, in part because I can see in some sense that this is what I would do if I was you, or what I would need you to do if you were me. So I think of deontic picturing then as a kind of shared practical picturing that involves the exercise of what Strawson calls the reactive attitudes. So these are affective states that involve evaluations of others, things like admiration, pride, disgust. Okay, so this is all in the background as part of the transition from non-discursive to discursive cognition. I think one of the roles for the philosopher here is to individuate intermediate categories between extremes that we don't at a given time understand how they relate. And so one of the things I'm trying to do here then is to interpose these intermediate categories. That'll come up a number of times. Okay, but I think of all this as ultimately being non-discursive. So the discursive account then is going to be founded on this notion of single-mindedness and rejection. So here's the idea. One chooses to do something single-mindedly just in case one rejects every choice incompatible with that choice. And so reject then is a primitive affective practical stance modeled on deontic picture. Now there's no supposition that ever entertains an attitude of rejection toward everything incompatible with what one does. Now, if negation's on the scene, that's actually kind of tricky because you can just say, well, I reject not doing it. But in the absence of negation, there's no supposition that maybe Kant, maybe Kant was someone who was in a mental state that involved rejecting everything incompatible with what he's decided he ought to do. But nevertheless, it's useful to model deontic cognition as if the kinds of mental states were ones that we could adopt. So hyperagents is the term I use to characterize the agents that are involved in planning. And there's a bunch of artificialities that are imposed in planning to make sense of it. But I think it's useful to think of the extremes, particularly when we're doing model construction, to think of the extremes in precise ways that may involve separating them from features that are part of what they are as a matter of the kind of thing they actually are in the world, as opposed to our model of them. So again, I took picturing to be a primitive joint mind-world and world-mind intentionality. But in the semantics, I'm treating mind-world intentionality in terms of possible worlds and world-mind intentionality in terms of plants. So that's an artificiality that's going to be useful. Similarly for the notion of rejection. So maybe only the angels ever, or can't ever entertain rejection in this way. Nevertheless, it's useful for we mere mortals to think of it in these terms, or so I claim. So single-mindedness then is a kind of self-mindedly binding myself to a course of action by not letting myself do anything incompatible with it. Think about the judgment that I ought to dress professionally tomorrow. And I'm planning on getting up for work tomorrow. That involves rejecting everything incompatible with it. So I reject gym clothes, for instance. And so, and one thing I might know as I'm planning my morning or my evening the night before is if my clothes are dirty, the only clean suit is dirty, then I need to get it cleaned or I need to touch it up or whatever. So single-mindedness then is a model for strong deontic modality. It's a kind of self-government. It's a practical self-government. It involves binding yourself to a course of action by not letting yourself do something that would contravene it. So I'll discuss more detail later. All right, so single-mindedness gives a notion of, I'm getting audio is still, yeah, I'm sorry, I hope this comes through as well as it can. Single-mindedness gives you an account of deontic, the strong deontic modality. Actually, let me check my connection real quick. This may kick me off. If I do, I'll come back. So I apologize. Hold on just a second.
Okay.
Okay, good. So let's try this again. Okay, so single-mindedness gives an account of the strong deontic modality.
Preston, can I quickly interrupt you? Or just proposes that maybe it would be a good idea if you close the video. Maybe that can add up some whatever.
Okay.
Although I hope you can still share your screen though. That's
yeah. Do you have the screen?
Yes.
You've got the screen. Okay, good, good. Okay, so single-mindedness gives the account of the strong deontic modality of obligation and forbiddance. And then the notion of indifference is used to specify the weak modality. Now, this is a historical flag. So the idea that you need two distinct choice attitudes was independently developed, from what I can tell, independently developed at least 3 times in 60 years. Gibbard does it in Thinking How to Live. There was a book by people like Schroeder and Dreyer claiming that you can't make sense of negation. Neither of them note this distinction. Well, Dreyer does in one essay and attributes it to Gibbard. He presents it as something novel. So it's actually there in Gibbard to begin with. It looks to me like Dreyer sort of comes to it on his own. It's actually in a couple of essays from Sellars in the 60s and early 70s. In each case, they characterize the strong attitude in terms of preference, but I don't think that's right, because an animal that's chasing a prey is exhibiting preferences, but that's not what is going on in deontic cognition. So I think really the idea is this notion of single-mindedness. Furthermore, once you've got single-mindedness, you can define difference in terms of single-mindedness. That's what I do here. So you use it differently just in case you're able to choose single-mindedly. So that's to rule out trivial cases where animals that can't single-mindedly count as choosing it differently. So choosing differently, you've got to be able to choose single-mindedly. The choice to A is indifferent just in case there's some action B incompatible with A, such that you could have chosen B without changing any of your single-minded choices. So if I think I ought to dress professionally, and I choosing differently between A and B is to rejecting each other. So rejection in this sense iterates in a way that's like negation. So consider a case of thinking I ought to dress professionally. If I think I ought to dress professionally and that I'm permitted to dress in a gray suit or black suit, then I'm planning to choose single-mindedly to dress professionally by rejecting everything incompatible, which means I'm not going to dress my gym clothes. But I'm planning to choose indifferently between the two suits in the sense that either of them, they each satisfy my single-minded choice to dress professionally. Okay, so then just for the semantics, fairly quickly, this is just a possible world semantics with the additional, it's basically a world semantics. It allows you to get Boolean logic, just the set theoretic operations that people have been with the middle of the 19th century. So let a deontic hyperplan be defined as a maximally consistent plan of action such that for every circumstance, every agent, and every choice, the agent either single-mindedly chooses to do that thing, chooses not to do it, indifferently chooses to do it, or indifferently chooses not to do it. So it just exhausts all the possibilities of agents, choices, and actions. So the on hyperplans are understood as intentions and action. So this allows you to distinguish choice to boil water in order to make tea from a choice to boil the water in order to make coffee. So the idea is that you individuate choices at enough fineness of grain that you can specify the prior intents and that the intentions and action are correct for that. Then we denote the semantic value of sentence 5 with these Scott brackets or these double brackets in terms of the semantic interpretation. So for world, for descriptive sentences, having the mind to fit world to fit, the interpretation of phi is going to be the set of worlds where phi is true. 3 kinds of deontic expressions are then defined in terms of plans of action. And I'm treating, at this point in the semantics, I'm treating just the prescriptive fragment. So I'm just looking at deontic hyperplans here. So to say that doing A is obliged in C expresses universally rejecting not doing A in C. That is to say, it's the set of deontic hyperplans where every agent chooses single-mindedly A and C. To say that doing A is forbidden in C then expresses universally rejecting doing A and C, which is the set of hyperplans where every agent chooses single-mindedly not A and C. And then to say that doing A is permitted in C expresses universally rejecting doing A and C, which is the set of hyperplans where every agent either single-mindedly chooses A and C or indifferently chooses whether or not to A and C. Okay, so intentional hyperplan is a maximally consistent plan of action, just in the same way that a deontic hyperplan was, but intentional hyperplans don't distinguish the attitudes of single-mindedness and indifference. This is because they don't have a strong and a weak deontic modality in the way that the deontic does. So where iota or I just say I when I read it out, where iota is a metalinguistic variable taking either the first person singular or plural pronoun as its value, I shall A C is the set of hyperplans where I choose A together on C in H, where together is important if you've got the plural pronoun we in play. So now in this case, what I've got here is I have the semantic interpretance as ordered triples. So before I was looking just at the single plans because I was considering only the fragment of the language where you have either just purely intentional or purely descriptive sentences. But we want to be able to model relations among these sentences. So we have to take as our semantic interpretant ordered triples of worlds, deontic hyperplans, and intentional hyperplans. But if you do that, you get just all of the regular classical logic defined in terms of operations and sets in the way that everyone's familiar with. Okay, you can then introduce quantification and you get the right kind of equivalences. It's provable that the negation of an obligation is a permission, even when you've got quantification on the scene. You can distinguish a ray and a dicto modality by relativizing semantic interpretations to worlds, as I do here. Then you can specify relationships between different kinds of modalities. So I'm going to just skip this, but you can ask me questions if you like. The temporal names, what will or was, can be modeled with these claims about necessity and possibility, then interactions between different kinds of modalities. So you can distinguish one should A in order to B, where the deontic modality has wide scope, and in order to be, one should A, where the teleological modality has wide scope. Furthermore, because you distinguish deontic from intentional hyperplans, there's a coherent but practically irrational mental state expressed by I, or we are A and we shall not. It's coherent that there are hyperstates, these ordered triples, that model that content, but it's practically irrational in the sense that there's no action you take that satisfies all of the planning commitments that you adopt when you express that claim. Okay, so now I'm going to look at some of the empirical support of the view and the predictions it makes. So I already mentioned neural mirroring and what I call shared practical picturing. So this is exactly what you would expect if shared intentionality involves this capacity to put yourselves into the perspectives of other people and plan on how you would behave if you were someone else. So here's Stephen Butterfield talking about neural mirroring and its role for understanding shared intentionality. Much coordination of joint action appears to involve not fully distinguishing others' actions from their own. Take motor simulation, task co-representation, and motor representation of collective goals. In each case, coordination involves motor or task representations of actions, tasks, or goals that let primarily another part in joint action. This is not a matter of representing others' plans as an observer. It's a matter of preparing actions and representing tasks achievable in ways that also be appropriate if it were you and not her who was about to perform. So I mentioned that the intentional hyperplanes don't distinguish single-mindedness and indifference. And this is because they don't have a distinction between a strong and a weak modal force. This suggests that shared intentionality is a more primitive kind of practical rationality, of practical cognition, than what's called deontic cognition. And there's some other things that support the suggestion. So you choose without choosing single-mindedly. So the wolf that chases a prey, say a wolf is chasing an antelope herd and is looking for a weak antelope or an antelope to chase, the wolf is going to make choices, but those choices aren't going to be single-minded in the sense that it's not adopting an affective stance, affective practical stance where it's binding itself to that course of action. And this can be seen because if the antelope that it chases suddenly gets a second wind and another one looks to stumble, the wolf choice will divert to the antelope without any consideration of anything it chose and so choosing single-mindedly looks like something that it's more complicated, requires additional cognitive complexity than simply choosing. Furthermore, with the notion of single-minded choice, you can discriminate practical genus-species relations. When I've planned on choosing indifferently between two suits as ways of satisfying my single-minded choice to dress professionally, I'm in practice classifying dressing in suits determinations of the determinable or a species of the genus dressing professionally. And I think the case can be made then that deontic cognition is the foundation of discursive cognition in the sense that it involves this kind of self-bindingness, this self-government. Because a human being in the Kantian context is an agent that acts not only in accord with a rule, but on the basis of a recognition of its propriety. So if we take this Kantian idea, one that makes its way through pragmatism into the work of Sellars, at least in the group they will take as our part of our inspiration, then we can think of deontic cognition as a mechanism for that kind of Kantian self-government, because it's single-mindedness that allows us to exercise that course of action where we don't allow ourselves to do something we've committed ourselves to rejecting. Furthermore, positive and negative reinforcement schedules instituted by shared intentionality suffice to set up normative statuses, even if the people engaged in that shared intentionality don't know what they're doing or aren't aware of what they're doing in the sense of awareness that comes with discursive self-government. So stick beating and flock tending are just negative and positive reinforcement. So acting on the intention to stick beat doing A and C and flock tend not doing A and C is one way of training people to conform to the norm that A is forbidden in C. And similarly, for any to norms about what's obliged and what's permitted. So this suggests that insofar as language is a norm-governed thing, some kind of vocal communication, a language might be undergoing development with all its syntactic complexity, subject relations, vocabulary, positional attitudes, modal operators. I see no reason to any kind of cognitive conceptual complexity in the language itself without anyone being able to choose single-minded. So long there were institutions in the community that were enforced through shared intentionality, there would have been norms concerning what's in the community. Okay, and there's a bunch of work been developmental psych out of shared intentionality, beginning in what is just around Michael.
Preston, now we almost cannot hear you.
Okay. Quite a bit of work been done in developmental psychology about the emergence of normative attitudes. Beginning at 9 months of age, humans exhibit a proclivity to share mental states with their caregivers. So attention and emotion, and from 9 months to age, this capacity for sharing mental states develops into a capacity to share and enforce norms. So in a recent review article by Schmidt and Riccozzi, they close with a claim that further research might support a view that is remarkably consonant with the one I've developed here. They say one picture that's worth being explored more systematically in future research is that while humans and other species primates share forms of individual intentionality and the corresponding natural norms of correctness and success, uniquely human forms of norm psychology, uniquely human forms of shared intentionality develop in close tandem in early ontogeny, the former building on and growing out of the latter. So insofar as deontic cognition involves single-mindedness, and that's something that's more conceptually sophisticated than simply choosing to do something. And insofar as that single-mindedness is founded on this distinction between a strong and a weak force, it does look like shared intentionality is the kind of thing that might, as a practical standpoint involving putting yourself into the position of other people, provide a foundation for what's going to be deontic cognition and the capacity to choose single-mindedly. But again, I'm thinking in terms of single-mindedness as a kind of abstract idealization. At the level of phylogeny, I think it's better to think in terms of shared practical picturing and deontic picturing, that hominids were developing a capacity not only to share mental state, but to do it in a way that involved normative or evaluative valences. Attitudes like admiration and disgust would have been important for that process. Okay, so I'm proposing our norm psychology develops out of shared intentionality. I'm suggesting something similar in the species. Okay, so engaged with Tomasello's work, Tomasello thinks that we can give an account of the development of human cognition on the basis of a two-step process of evolution from joint to collective intentionality. Joint intentionality involves sharing mental states with small groups, restricted. This can be people hunting, small groups of people hunting in the time that they're hunting, or in building tools in the time that they're building tools. But there's no expansive sense of what he calls collective intentionality, which is in principle unrestricted in space and time, where the members of the community are people that you might never meet, you might not even be able to meet. Tomasello's claim is that human cognition involves judgments about what is true and moral as what's binding on everyone. So joint intentionality isn't only enough to account for human cognition, but rather there's a necessity for collective intentionality, because collective intentionality is what allows us to conceive of what's true and what's moral as what's binding on everyone. And as he lays this out, he notes there may need to be additional stages interposed between joint intentionality and the development of human cognition. And I can be seen as proposing some intermediate stage, that between the development of collective intentionality and the development of human cognition, we need a notion of single-mindedness, because this is what allows us to account for recognizing something as true or good, in the sense of recognition that involves not merely acting in conformity with a norm, but on the basis of an awareness of its propriety, responding to it as something that demands our obedience. So I think it's plausible that we could have been able to speak a language sharing intentions to communicate, which could have been norm governed long before we were aware of norms in the sense of awareness that involves deontic and ultimate discursive cognition. And then mindedness is what allows you or what allowed us to adopt those recognitive stances. Okay, so one last thing about the empirical support and predictions. So Brandon and McDowell had this debate about whether logic use is necessary for reason mongering. Brandon thinks that no, there could have been human beings that were engaged in the practice of giving and asking for reasons without logic yet being on the scene, and that the virtue of logic is that it makes explicit what was implicit in those reasoning practices. McDowell says no, there's no sense in which a group of people reasoning, except insofar as they're using logical operators. My suggestion is that it's not logic that makes the difference, it's single-mindedness. Because single-mindedness is what allows you to recognize as these sense that involves deontic cognition. So it's entirely possible, as far as I can see, the community might have been using logical without engaging in deontic cognition. I'm getting an internet connection stable message. I hope people can still hear me. Anyway, that's what I'll say about that. A way of trying to to this random sort of throw my hat in. Although I was told, my father always said that you should never get in the middle of a fight between two dogs that are bigger than you, and so this may not be a good idea, but that's my claim anyway.
Preston, 10 minutes.
Yes. Minutes. Yes. Yes. Okay. Thank you. So now I'm going to get into the stuff that's a little. It's this stuff is all still in process. So maybe I've only got about 10 minutes left, so maybe I'll do this a little quicker anyway. I'm positive we'll not get to absolute knowing, but it's implicit in what we're doing, I hope. Okay, so consider the following inference. I want to get to Prague tomorrow morning. The best way to get to Prague tomorrow morning is to take the 8 a.m. train. Thus, I will take the 8 a.m. train. These is maintained, and deontic cognition involves single-mindedness. Where's single-mindedness in this inference? The conclusion is drawn with the expression of a shared intention. There's no deontic claim here. Now, you might think it's enthymematic, that there's a suppressed premise here, something like you have to do what's best, and maybe there's a conditional and you detach. But this is to treat deontic cognition as a kind of punctate mental act that is something like observing fact and then proceeding to draw some inferences or something else. I think this is an instance of what calls a declarative fallacy. Instead, I want to adopt Jeremy Kuh's proposal for material practical inferences. And it was actually a discussion with Jeremy that led me to see that I needed to address this issue. So it seems to me that this inference is perfectly fine on its own. There's no need to impose additional reasoning here. It involves a kind of material practical inference. Just part of what it is to have desire and to think that some way to satisfy that desire is to ceteris paribus form intention to satisfy your desire. And then single-mindedness should be seen not in some particular mental act, but in a commitment that spells itself out over the course of planning or realizing the plan that's expressed with that intention. So as I'm thinking about what to do in the night before, I have to make decisions to make sure I'm ready and I'm awake and that my bags are packed. When I wake up in the morning, I have to make sure I'm not allowing desire to sleep in, to suppress my commitment. And this is really single-mindedness as a kind of self-government. I suppress my desires, even though I'd like to sleep in, because I've committed myself to a plan, the reasons for which presumably are still in force. And so the intention then acts as a kind of guide that my single-mindedness binds itself to over the course of realizing that plan. Okay, so I think that we can then spell a difference between moral and instrumental practical rationality in the sense that the moral law applies independently of one's person and place in space and time. It's not contingent upon one person or a group of people's desires. That's a claim in meta-ethics, though. That's a claim about the semantics for deontic modality as being unrestricted when it comes to agencies, the agents and circumstances that a duty or an obligation applies to. It's not a claim in normative ethics. So as far as I can see, that's compatible with being a deontologist, a virtue theorist, an ethics of care, consequentialism, what have you. Okay, so let me mention just, I've got about 5 minutes left here. So let me just get enough of the proof theory and model theory stuff on the board to at least indicate how I think my view, which might look to be in conflict with Stephanie's, is actually compatible. So there's a tortured history to the term intentional semantics. In contemporary philosophers' idiolects, intentional semantics is often coextensional with possible world semantics. This is owed to Carnap's decision in Meaning and Necessity to use the term intention to replace what Frege talked about in terms of senses. Now, the distinction between sense and reference had been marked for centuries. It shows up in the medieval position signification distinction. It's in the logic of Port Royal. It's in the logics of Kant and Peirce, Boole, and just about everyone. Frege has sense and reference. Carnap in Meaning and Necessity says, well, look, sense, we can't get a algebraic grip on it. I'm going to use this Leibnizian term intention, and I'm going to define intention as a function from a state description to an extension. Now, that is essentially possible world semantics. State descriptions are maximally determinate states of affairs where every sentence or its negation is included. Carnap doesn't have an accessibility relation. It was one of Kripke's brilliant discoveries was to see accessibility as what allows us to distinguish the modal axioms that C.I. Lewis botanized in the 20s. But it's there in Carnap essentially. Okay, so this view of intentions takes the outputs to be extensions, to be referenced in the world. But the old notion of intention or comprehension, I prefer the term comprehension because it doesn't seem to have this baggage that intention has got. The old term of comprehension was not about a relationship between words or concepts in the world, but about a relationship between concepts or between words.
5 minutes, Preston.
5 minutes. Okay, yes. So so the notion of comprehension then doesn't involve word and world relations, but rather interlinguistic relations within language or within thought. So I think what I've developed is a model theory as a basis for word to fit world extensions involved modeling theoretical rationality, and world to fit word extensions modeling practical rationality using possible worlds of language. Now, this leaves room then for taking proof theory as specifying comprehensions in terms of concept containment or word-word relations. And if that's right, if that's a good way of reconstructing the old extension comprehension distinction, so that comprehension is modeled with proof theory as opposed to trying to build comprehension inside model theory, then it should be useful in sorting out some debates. So what I want to do is mention two and look at least one. So the first is Stephanie's account of the what she calls the metalinguistic interpretation of Sellars' account of ethical statements. And then the other is Incravati and Schloeder's proof theoretic interpretation of deontic modality. Because if I'm right that model theory and proof theory are complementary, then there should be a way to reconcile these different groups. So in Stephanie's essay, she argues that Sellars in his later work comes around to understanding the object language claim one ought to A and C, not as a direct expression of a shared intention, but as what would be said in the meta language is we shall A is implied by we shall promote the general welfare. And the double use of the quotes there indicates that we're talking about language. And she notes that this involves an indirect connection to agency because we're going through the meta language here. Now, in other work, I've argued that you can give an interpretation of the atomic sentences in proof theoretic semantics in terms of the role of those sentences as premises and inference. So the meaning of a sentence in proof theoretic semantics is the role it plays in explaining things and being explained by things. This gives you an introduction and elimination for atoms under that intended interpretation. Nassim Frances has this book on proof theoretic semantics where he lays this out, and he uses introduction and elimination rules for specifying the meaning of a sentence. So the idea is that a conjunction means what it does in virtue of the introduction rule for conjunction and the elimination rule for conjunction. So specify logical I've given introduction and elimination rules for atoms in terms of rules and explanation that gives them a meaning in a proof theoretic semantics. So this is hyperintentional, proper sense of hyperintentionality. But the very term hyperintentionality is an artifact of the decision to use extensions as the meanings of what get called intentional sentences. So it's just confused to think in those terms. But it's easy to see that it's hyperintentional because the meaning of A is going to differ from the meaning of A, because A and A is going to be justified by the introduction, and A is going to be justified by whatever its introduction rule is. So it's easily hyperintentional. So now consider what Doc Sellars would say in response to the following. Why ought one A? A response would be, because we shall A is implied by we shall promote the general welfare. Because we shall A is implied by we shall promote the general welfare. That's to say there's a good explanation for why one ought to A that diverts the implication relation between shared intentionality and promoting the general welfare. But according to Frances and my work, that suffices to give the proof theoretic meaning of one ought to A. So we can see Stephanie then is giving, in her meta-linguistic interpretation, a proof theoretic analysis of the comprehension of claims like one ought to A, whereas I'm giving a model theoretic analysis of their extension. And so this then I claim is compatible. The two views are compatible. Okay, if I had more, I'll stop here. If I had more time, I talk about the indirectness of the metalinguistic account. Something similar is true of the account that's given by Ingrid Schloeder. And I think that if you look at bilateral semantics, there's a way of seeing the way bilateral semantics reduces logically complex sentences to complexes of attitudes of assertion and denial in a way that suggests there's an additional interposition between Tomasello's collective intentionality and human cognition. But not only do you need single-mindedness, which involves what I call a agentive rejection, where I'm rejecting choices, you also need linguistic denial as a proof of that interlinguistic word-word relation. So that's in the background. And as I say, this stuff is all tentative. I'm hoping I can spell it out as I go forward, and I look forward to questions and comments from people. So thank you for bearing with me.
Thank you, Preston. And okay, so if you have a question, raise your hand, wave at me, or give a signal in the chat. Okay. Yeah. Ronald.
Hey, Preston, thanks a lot. Wow, that was massive. And thanks for the PowerPoint slides. They helped a lot, given that your internet connection was really shaky. So I have just a clarificatory question about the earlier parts of the paper. So where you introduce the idea of this formal semantics representing, if I understand, belief contents or meanings of declarative sentences in terms of sets of possible words, and the meaning of prescriptive sentences or sentences expressing intentions in terms of sets of deontic hyperplanes, deontic hyperstates, if I get this right. So could this formal semantics account for the possibility that a belief and an intention or a declarative statement and a statement expressing intention could have the same propositional content? I mean, given that one is modeled in terms of hyperplanes, whereas the other is modeled in terms of possible worlds. And it seems like they're formally speaking, at least, cognitive states or the sentences expressing them with different directions of fit could not have the same propositional content. Is that right? And
well,
if that's right at all, does it matter?
It depends on what you mean by propositional content. That's not something I've given much thought to. I think I would like to be in a position to say that's not one of my terms. Although I don't know that that's true. I probably use it at some point, but I haven't given it much thought. To the extent that I do use it, I just think of it in terms of what I've stipulated as the semantic interpretants for these things. So, strictly speaking, for the semantics, the interpretants are sets of triples of worlds, deontic hyperplanes, and intentional hyperplanes. And then it's going to be the case that the meanings of the cup is on the shelf, and I shall put the cup on the shelf different, because they involve different sets of hyperstates. Now, you might have a view that says for the cup being on the shelf, or the cup is on the shelf, and then give some kind of an account of attitude as a force marker and attitude that give you something that's not part of that, but is a different thing. That's not my view. It's not obviously a fault of mine. be more clearly committed to the distinction between propositional kinds in those cases, but I'm not committed to that being the case. So if someone wants to tweak it and do something with that.
Okay, Preston, we still have problems hearing you, so speak really slowly. Articulate very carefully.
Yes, okay, I will try.
Yeah. It's a pity, but never mind. Kirill.
Hi, thanks. Yeah, many interesting things, and I am interested in the work of people looking at the intersection, or points for dialogue between Sellars and Tomasello. I think it's an exciting bit of sort of cross-disciplinary work, but I'm kind of a bit confused, I guess, about why I haven't really seen critiques of Tomasello's particular brand of philosophizing about his own findings from Sellarians. I think Tomasello kind of picks bits of philosophy from here and there. He's quite keen on Searle, he's quite keen on Davidson, but from a Sellarian point of view, there seem to be quite a few problems and quite a few places where Tomasello's and Schmidt's and Rakici's dualism would have a problem for a Sellarian. I'm not sure what a shared mental state is, for example. When does one mental state end and the next one starts? Do we need an extra mental state to know when I'm sharing a mental state with someone? And Tomasello's starting position of infants starting from a veil of ignorance where they have mutual trust and respect from each other, and then go through a process of inner labeling that they then share in order to become social and communicative. This idea of lots of fully fledged concepts that they've got up and running, that they then, once they have those private concepts, make explicit. I think there's lots of parts of it which of course are really unique and powerful bits of empirical work, but I often feel like I wish Sellarians would push back against some of the ways in which Tomasello especially, and to some extent Schmidt and Rakic phrase it.
Yeah, that's fair, Kirill. I would direct you to chapter 2 of my. One of the things that Tomasello does is he relies on Bratman's notion of shared intentionality. He just sort of has an offhand remark in a couple of places that's the way he's approaching it. Now, Glendatney and Lotso-Corin have both argued that there's problems with that, precisely because Bratman has this really conceptually sophisticated notion of shared intentionality. I not only have to share an intention with you, but I have to know that you share me. I have to know that you know that I share an intention with you. In chapter 2 of my book, I take this stuff on board and I argue that some of the work that Butterfeld in particular has done in looking at neural mirroring and processes of what I call shared practical picturing and accounting for shared intentionality can be slotted in as a substitute for Tomasello's appeal to Bratman's analysis in a way that allows him to entitle himself to the non-discursive resources that I claim these notions of picturing entitle. So absolutely right. You know, Tomasello's, it's great that he's doing all this popularizing work. That the first, not only does he appeal to Sellars in a number of places, and some of his folks working with him do as well. First page of A Natural History of Human Thinking refers to both Hegel and Peirce. So he's squarely in the field of the kind of work that folks like us should be familiar with. But I absolutely agree, we shouldn't be taking it on uncritically, and we have just as much benefit to offer the science they do, I think. So that's fair.
Okay, I just have a look if there's another question. If not, then I would like to ask one myself or two. Yeah, the first question that I have, I wondered how sharp that distinction between choosing single-mindedly and choosing indifferently is in, say, real-life situations. Because I understand that when you use these notions for semantic modeling, then you can just say that there is a sharp boundary, yeah. But then you want to apply that to real-life situations. And how sharp is that distinction? Like sometimes we do not choose in terms of something like a real moral ought. We choose based on preferences, but still, say, the preferences might be very strong. Yeah, and my attitude of not rejecting the alternatives, that might be a weak attitude, actually just a weak rejection in terms of strength of the rejection. So it would be hard to change my decision. On the other hand, there might be decisions which are genuinely moral decisions, but where my attitude of rejecting the alternatives might still be rather weak, as in in a moral dilemma, for example, you know, where I might be easily swayed in my decision, where I might be unsure. Yeah. So that would be the question: how sharp is that distinction? That would be the first one, and the second one, when you talked about introducing ought statements as being explained by statements about the implication relations between we intentions. I just wondered what kind of explanation you have in mind, because there are different kinds of explanations. Yeah, there are causal ones, or there are ones in terms of mechanism, or there's just maybe broadly reason-giving ones. So what kind of explanation is that? Thank you.
Yeah, okay, well, so thank you. And I'm sorry I wasn't able to get more into your essay in this talk. I tried to address it in the chat that deals. I hope I do justice to your view, because I think it's a great view. So on the first, you have to throw my hands up and say, yeah, we're sublunary beings. We don't think the way Kant thought we think. Most of what we do is motivated by all kinds of unreflective processes, lots of subconscious, maybe we don't even know. It's not possible for us to know what's motivating us. And then I don't know what to say. My hope is I hope that could be used for people to do things like conflict resolution. So think about what's involved when you are engaged in certain kind of conflict resolution. Oftentimes what they have you do is imagine yourself from the other person's perspective, try to adopt their point of view. It seems to me that's a kind of trans-perspectival, practical rationality that I'm hoping my approach can help model. And then but that kind of work, the emphasis is going to be on the non-discursive, what I was calling the non-discursive side, in particular, deontic picturing. And when it comes to deontic picturing, if there is anything like that, it's not going to be the sort of thing that's modeled by rejection as an attitude that's in taking everything incompatible with the action and rejecting. At the same time, one of the things that I think is worth looking into is if there really is a notion of single-mindedness, that an objection that lies to the back of the cognition. 2 years of age, children who are playing in a joint game with someone else break off and do another game if the other game is more enjoyable. Even the first game is implicitly entered into as something they're going to do together. But by the age of 3, children who have explicitly a game together with someone else, they are pulled away by something that's more enticing, will ask for permission to leave. So it seems like at this stage, they're aware of the normative dimension superimposes itself on top of our shared activities. If I'm right that deontic cognition involves rejection, then in principle, it should be possible to see some kind of cognitive compatible that the 3 is responsive to, that the child at 2 isn't. So that's a way of trying to address your question by emphasizing the need to look at the wetware of the brain and the physiology and the psychology. When it comes to the semantics, yeah, I'm just taking them as explicit sort of, I'm treating them as and then I don't know what the actual fact of the matter in our brains is going to look like. But my hope is that there's enough here to try to get in. Your second question, what kind of explanation is involved in my attempt to recognize this proof of analysis by assimilating it to my interpretation of the time.
We cannot hear you anymore, Preston. Preston, are you still there? Seems. So it seems as if Preston has gone. Preston, we can't hear you. So maybe I suggest that we finish this session, have a break, and maybe Preston will be back with a stabler connection afterwards, so we can chat about things afterwards if there's room. Yeah.
Maybe what we could try is, Preston, if you can hear us, disconnect, or I can disconnect you actually and force you to reconnect, and maybe that works. I don't know. Shall we try that?
Yeah, I think
okay. Might as well.
We could, yeah.
Let's see.
Preston, you might also try rebooting your Wi-Fi as well as your computer.
It's a hotspot, and so I don't know if that matters. Can you guys hear me?
Right now?
Now
yeah.
I can.
Yeah. Okay. Well, I don't know what, I don't want to go over time. Let me just at least answer Stephanie's last question. It's a great question. What kind of explanation is involved? I have not given it much thought. In the essay where I lay out the semantics for atomic sentences in a proof theoretic semantics, I rely on Jared Milson's notion of a best explanation, but that's developed in the sciences. So I'm open to the possibility that there are, say, moral explanations or other kinds of explanation, and I just haven't given it much thought.
Okay, yes, thank you for these answers. I just have a look whether there's more questions. Okay. Yeah, Lionel.
I don't know if there's time, but just Preston, thanks. A clarificatory question. Could you say something about the connection between single-minded choice and self-government by norms? So is the idea that endorsing normative like ought statements is somehow implicit in the practice of every single-minded chooser, and if so, how, and if not, what is the connection you see between those, between single-minded choice and self-government?
I wouldn't say that every single-minded choice is a responsiveness to a thought of what to do, but that every responsiveness to a thought of what one ought to do is or expresses a single-minded choice. And then the way I see them, so in the book, I adopt psychological nominalism at the beginning. And my claim is that responsiveness to reasons as rules prescribing behavior requires a language that represents those rules. And then psychological nominalism is the mechanism for having a representation of a rule. But by the end of it, I'm open to the possibility that we might be responsive to rules represented as such in ways that are non-linguistic. What's important for my story, though, is that you can get a language on the scene in terms of norms enforced by shared intentionality without anybody exercising single-mindedness. So that once you've got language on the scene, then the ability to exercise single-mindedness gives you a capacity to be responsive to rules represented as such, and language is what gives you the representation of rules. Does that answer your question?
Maybe I'll have to think more about it. Thanks.
Okay.
Okay. So there seem to be no more questions. Yeah, at the end now we could hear you really well. I don't know what happened, but now
Well, look,
that was
yeah,
perfect.
Yeah. All I can say, it's great. This is my first time being back in Montana in 3 years. It's great to be home, but you make certain concessions when you live out here. So.
Yeah, I know that. Okay, then I think that we thank Preston. Thanks a lot for the talk.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate it. I look forward to the rest of this too. This is just great.